The bustling international terminal at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport was alive with its usual symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and muffled announcements echoing through the high ceilings. It was just another busy Friday afternoon, with travelers rushing to catch their flights or dragging their feet after long journeys. Among the crowd, a young black teenager stood out, not because he wanted to, but because his quiet confidence and impeccable style naturally drew attention. He was 16, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and pressed khakis, carrying a leather laptop bag that spoke of quality without screaming luxury. His clothes weren't flashy. They were simply well chosen, like someone who understood the difference between showing off and showing up prepared. As he walked through the terminal, his polished loafers clicked against the gleaming floor, echoing the same steady rhythm as the business people hurrying past. He'd made this walk dozens of times before, knowing exactly which turns to take to reach the VIP lounge where he usually waited for his next flight. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another message from his dad checking if he'd arrived safely. But something felt different today. He noticed the side glances from the security personnel stationed along the corridors. It wasn't anything new to him. He experienced these looks before, the ones that questioned his presence in certain spaces. He'd been taught how to handle them. Head high, back straight, keep moving forward. Two security officers standing near the duty-free shop whispered to each other as he passed. One of them adjusted his radio, speaking into it in hushed tones. The teenager pretended not to notice, but his grip on his laptop bag tightened slightly. He'd learned from his parents that reaction was a choice, and he chose to remain composed. The VIP lounge entrance was just ahead, its frosted glass doors promising the familiar comfort of quiet corners and comfortable chairs. He reached into his pocket for his membership card, the same routine he followed countless times before. Around him, the airport continued its endless dance of arrivals and departures, families saying goodbye, and business travelers speed-walking to their gates. A group of passengers nearby were arguing with an airline representative about a delayed flight, their voices rising above the general hum of the terminal. A child's laughter rang out somewhere behind him, followed by the gentle scolding of a tired parent. These were the normal sounds of airport life, the background music to what should have been just another routine travel day. But as he approached the lounge entrance, he noticed a security officer watching him intently. The officer's hand rested on his belt, his stance shifting from casual to alert. The teenager took a deep breath, reminding himself of his father's words. Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you carry yourself in the face of that treatment. Little did anyone in that busy terminal know that this moment was about to become much more than just another story of prejudice at an airport. The wheels of an important lesson were about to be set in motion, one that would ripple through the halls of this massive aviation hub and beyond, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways no one could have predicted. The familiar weight of his phone in his pocket felt different now. It wasn't just a device for staying in touch with his dad anymore. In a few moments, it would become a tool for teaching one of the most powerful lessons about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of authority in modern America. The security officer moved with deliberate slowness, his boots making heavy sounds against the polished floor as he approached the teenager. His face wore that all too familiar expression of unearned authority, the kind that comes from a badge rather than respect. "Excuse me, young man," he called out, his voice carrying just a bit too loud, designed to draw attention. "I'm going to need to see some identification." The teenager had already pulled out his VIP lounge access card, holding it ready. But the officer barely glanced at it, instead asking for additional forms of ID. Around them, other travelers slowed their pace, some pretending to check their phones while watching the scene unfold. The terminal's usual buzz of activity seemed to dim slightly, as if the air itself was growing thicker with tension. "Sir, I have all my credentials right here," the teenager said calmly, his voice steady despite the embarrassment of being singled out. He'd been raised to handle these situations with grace. but that didn't make them any easier to bear. The officer took his time examining each document, holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. "And what exactly brings you to the VIP lounge?" the officer questioned, his tone suggesting that the very idea was suspicious. He emphasized the word VIP as if it were impossible to believe. "This isn't a place for just anyone to hang around, you understand." A small crowd had gathered now, keeping their distance but watching intently. An elderly couple shook their heads in disapproval, not at the teenager, but at the officer's obvious prejudice. A flight attendant paused nearby, her rolling suitcase forgotten at her side as she witnessed the scene with growing concern. "I'm a regular member here," the teenager explained, maintaining his composure even as the officer's questions became increasingly condescending. He could feel his phone buzzing again in his pocket, probably his father wondering why he hadn't checked in yet. But he kept his hands visible and his movements slow, just as he'd been taught. The officer circled him slowly, eyeing his expensive laptop bag with obvious suspicion. "This looks like a pretty nice bag for someone your age," he commented, his implication clear in his tone. "Mind if we take a look inside?" It wasn't really a question. They both knew that. Other security officers had drifted closer, creating an unnecessarily intimidating presence in the terminal. The teenager stood perfectly still, his heart racing but his exterior calm, as the lead officer began methodically removing items from his bag. Each piece was handled roughly, with little regard for the expensive electronics or personal belongings inside. A teenager with a first-class lounge membership, designer clothes, and high-end electronics, the officer listed off, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You've got to admit, that's a bit unusual." He spread the teenager's belongings across a nearby seat, making a show of inspecting each item. The humiliation was calculated, designed to make a point about who belonged and who didn't. But what the officer didn't realize was that he was about to learn his own lesson of assumptions and authority. The teenager's phone kept buzzing, and now text messages were starting to pop up on the screen. Messages from someone whose name would soon wipe that smug look off the officer's face. A business traveler had stopped to record the incident on his phone, his face reflecting both concern and anger at what he was witnessing. The teenager noticed but didn't react. He knew that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice was to let it expose itself, to let others see it for what it really was. As the officer continued his theatrical investigation, the teenager finally reached for his still buzzing phone. He knew it was time to answer those messages, time to shift the power dynamic that the officer thought was so firmly in his favor. What happened next would change not just this moment, but the way things worked in this airport for years to come. The humiliation reached its peak as the officer dumped the contents of the teenager's laptop bag onto a nearby table. His expensive computer, carefully organized files, and personal items scattered across the surface while other travelers watched in uncomfortable silence. The officer picked through the items with exaggerated slowness, making comments under his breath, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Pretty fancy stuff for a kid," he smirked, holding up the high-end laptop. "Where'd you get all this from?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The teenager felt his cheeks burning, but kept his voice steady as he answered. "Everything here is mine, sir. I can show you receipts if you'd like." A young mother pulled her children closer as they passed by, shooting a sympathetic look at the teenager. Her little boy tugged at her sleeve and whispered too loudly, "Mommy, why is that policeman being mean?" The mother quickly hustled her children away, but her question echoed what everyone was thinking. The crowd around them had grown larger, with most people no longer pretending to be busy with their phones or luggage. A flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold finally stepped forward. "Sir," she addressed the officer, "I see this young man in the lounge regularly. There's really no need for—" "Ma'am, please step back," the officer cut her off sharply. "This is a security matter." He turned back to the teenager, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So, you're a regular here, huh? Must be nice. Mind telling us what exactly brings you to this airport so often? The teenager took a deep breath, remembering all the times his father had prepared him for moments like this. I travel frequently for my father's business, he explained calmly, though his hands were trembling slightly as he watched the officer carelessly handle his belongings. A businessman in an expensive suit had stopped nearby, his face darkening as he watched the scene unfold. He pulled out his phone and began recording, making no attempt to hide what he was doing. The officer noticed and turned toward him. "Sir, you need to put that phone away." "No, I don't think I will," the businessman replied firmly. "This needs to be documented." Other phones had appeared in the crowd as well, their cameras capturing the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. The teenager's phone buzzed again, the seventh time in the past few minutes. The officer snatched it up before the boy could reach for it. "Now, who's so eager to reach you?" he asked, turning the phone over in his hands. The screen lit up with another incoming message, and for a moment, the officer's expression flickered as he saw the sender's name. An older gentleman in the crowd spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of years of similar experiences. "Young man," he called out to the teenager, "you don't have to put up with this. You have rights." The teenager nodded gratefully but remained silent, knowing that what was about to happen would speak louder than any words he could say. The phone buzzed again, and this time the officer's face changed completely as he read the message preview. His confident smirk wavered, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. The teenager finally spoke up, his voice clear and controlled. "Officer, I believe you should answer that call. It's my father, and he's very interested in discussing airport security protocols with you." The atmosphere in the terminal shifted palpably. Something in the teenager's tone made the officer look at him more carefully, really seeing him for the first time. The crowd sensed it too, the subtle shift in power that was taking place. They were about to witness something that would remind everyone that appearances can be deceiving, and respect should never be determined by assumptions. A young woman in a business suit had been watching the entire scene unfold while waiting for her flight. She'd seen similar situations before, but something about this one felt different. Her hands were steady as she held her phone, recording everything. She knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply document the truth. "I travel through this airport twice a month," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And I've never seen anyone subjected to this kind of treatment in the VIP area." Other frequent flyers around her nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mix of concern and anger at the unfolding situation. The officer was still holding the teenager's phone, which kept lighting up with incoming messages. Each buzz seemed to make him more uncomfortable, especially as he caught glimpses of the sender's name and position in the message previews. His confident stance had started to waver, though he was trying hard not to show it. "Look," the officer said, his tone suddenly less aggressive. "We're just doing our job. Airport security is a serious matter." But even as he spoke, more people were pulling out their phones to record. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now, all watching intently as this small drama played out in the middle of the busy terminal. A pilot walking past stopped to observe the scene. With decades of experience written on his face, he stepped forward. "In all my years flying through this airport," he said calmly, "I've never seen a VIP lounge member subjected to this kind of search without cause." His uniform and commanding presence added weight to his words. The teenager stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. He watched as the officer struggled to maintain his authority while more and more messages appeared on the phone screen. One of the messages must have been particularly significant because the officer's face suddenly lost its color. The businesswoman who had been recording stepped closer. "I think we all know what's happening here," she said firmly. "And I've already sent several videos to my network of travel journalists. They're very interested in how VIP members are treated at this airport." The atmosphere in the terminal had changed completely. What started as a simple power play by an overconfident officer had transformed into something much bigger. The watching crowd wasn't just witnessing an incident anymore. They were seeing justice unfold in real time. Another buzz from the phone, and this time the officer actually jumped. He looked at the screen, then at the teenager, then back at the screen. His hands, which had been so steady while searching through the boy's belongings, were now visibly shaking. "Sir," the teenager said quietly, breaking his silence. "My father is asking to speak with you. He's very concerned about this situation." The way he said "father" carried a weight that made several people in the crowd exchange knowing looks. They could sense that something big was about to happen. The officer's radio crackled to life. A voice on the other end asked him to confirm his location. He responded hesitantly, aware that every word was being recorded by multiple phones. The voice on the radio sounded urgent, almost nervous. The crowd watched as a group of senior airport officials appeared at the end of the terminal, walking quickly toward the scene. Their faces were serious, their pace urgent. The officer saw them too, and his remaining confidence seemed to drain away completely. The teenager remained perfectly composed, straightening his jacket as he watched the officials approach. He'd been raised to handle difficult situations with grace, and now that grace was about to be rewarded. The crowd could sense it. They were about to witness one of those rare moments when justice arrives wearing a business suit instead of a uniform. The head of airport security arrived first, his polished shoes clicking rapidly against the terminal floor. He was followed closely by two other senior officials, their faces showing a mix of concern and urgency. The crowd parted automatically to let them through, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The teenager's phone, still in the officer's trembling hands, buzzed one more time. The head of security took one look at the situation. The scattered belongings on the table, the recording phones in the crowd, the visibly shaken officer, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "Officer, hand me that phone right now," he commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of real leadership. The officer complied without a word, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The head of security looked at the screen, then at the teenager, and his expression softened with recognition. "Sir," he addressed the teenager with genuine respect, "I sincerely apologize for this situation. Your father is on his way down right now." He turned to the officer, his face hardening. "Officer, step aside and wait here. We'll discuss this incident in detail very shortly." The watching crowd murmured as they noticed the dramatic shift in how the teenager was being addressed. The same boy who moments ago had been treated with suspicion was now being spoken to with evident respect by the head of security himself. One of the other officials quickly began gathering the teenager's belongings, handling each item with careful respect, a stark contrast to how they'd been dumped out earlier. "Sir, please let us know if anything is missing or damaged," she said, her tone professional but genuinely apologetic. The businesswoman who had been recording stepped forward. "I have the entire incident on video," she offered. The way this young man was treated was completely unacceptable. Several others in the crowd nodded, holding up their phones to indicate they too had recorded everything. A new buzz of excitement rippled through the terminal as more security personnel appeared, these ones dressed in suits rather than uniforms. They moved with purpose, creating a perimeter around the area. The officer who had caused all this trouble stood to the side, looking increasingly pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The teenager finally allowed himself to check his phone when it was returned to him. Reading through the messages, he took a deep breath and looked at the head of security. "My father will be here in about 2 minutes," he said quietly. "He's coming from the main office." The crowd, which had grown even larger, sensed that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Parents were explaining to their children in hushed voices about the importance of not judging people by their appearance. Business travelers were shaking their heads, sharing similar stories they'd witnessed or experienced. The terminal's usual sounds seemed to fade into the background as everyone waited. The officer who had caused this situation shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, his earlier swagger replaced by visible anxiety. He kept glancing toward the main corridor, knowing that someone important was about to arrive. A young airport employee who had been watching everything unfold whispered to her colleague, "I heard his dad is someone really important here." Her colleague replied, "Important doesn't even begin to cover it." The head of security checked his own phone and straightened his tie. The other officials did the same, all of them obviously preparing for someone whose authority far exceeded their own. The teenager stood calmly in the middle of all this activity, his composure unshaken despite everything he'd just been through. The atmosphere in the terminal was electric with anticipation. Everyone could feel that they were about to witness not just the resolution of an injustice, but a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and true authority. The next few minutes would become a story that everyone present would tell for years to come. The atmosphere in the terminal changed instantly when the teenager's father appeared. He walked with the confidence of someone who didn't just work in the building, he owned it. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he moved with purpose, each step carrying the weight of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The crowd fell completely silent. Even people rushing to catch flights stopped to watch. The father's presence commanded attention without him saying a word. Behind him walked two board members and his personal assistant, all carrying expressions that meant business. "Son," he said softly, reaching the scene. His voice was calm, but carried across the silent terminal. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, then turned to face the officer who had caused all this trouble. The contrast between the father's quiet dignity and the officer's earlier behavior was striking. The head of security stepped forward. "Sir, I can explain." But the father raised his hand slightly, and the official fell silent immediately. That simple gesture showed everyone watching exactly who was in charge of this airport. "My son," the father began, his voice measured but firm, "has been coming to this airport since he was 5 years old. He helped plant those trees outside Terminal B when he was 7. He spent his summers learning every aspect of airport operations. This isn't just an airport to him. It's part of his heritage." The officer who had harassed the teenager seemed to shrink with each word. The father continued, "When I bought controlling interest in this airport 15 years ago, I made a promise that it would be a place where everyone, regardless of who they are, would be treated with respect." A ripple of realization moved through the crowd. Phones were still recording, capturing this moment when assumptions and prejudice came face to face with reality. Some people in the crowd nodded in understanding, finally placing where they'd seen the father's face before, on the airport's board of directors wall. The father turned to address the growing crowd, his voice carrying natural authority. "What happened here today is not what this airport stands for. This is not just about my son. This is about every passenger who walks through these terminals. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity." The officer started to speak. "Sir, I was just following." But the father interrupted him gently. "Following what exactly? Your assumptions? Your prejudices? Tell me, which security protocol suggests humiliating a legitimate VIP lounge member in front of dozens of witnesses?" The businesswoman who had been recording stepped forward. "Sir," she said, "I have the entire incident on video." The father nodded appreciatively. "Thank you," he replied. "Please send that to our customer relations department. It will be valuable for our staff training." The father then did something unexpected. Instead of calling for the officer's immediate dismissal, as everyone expected, he turned to his son. "What do you think should happen here?" he asked. The crowd held their breath, waiting for the response. The teenager looked at the officer, then at his father. Despite everything he'd just been through, his voice was steady. "I think this could be a learning opportunity," he said. "Maybe not just for him, but for the whole airport." The father smiled slightly, pride evident in his expression. He turned back to the officer and the other officials. My son just showed more wisdom than years of expensive security training apparently have. This incident will lead to changes, but not just punitive ones. We're going to use this to make things better." The crowd watched as the father placed his arm around his son's shoulders, the picture of dignity and grace under pressure. In that moment, everyone present understood they had witnessed something more than just the revelation of the teenager's identity. They had seen a masterclass in handling prejudice with wisdom and strength. The father gently guided his son and the officer away from the crowd towards a quieter area of the terminal. The head of security and board members followed, their faces serious but thoughtful. The gathered crowd remained, watching as this important moment unfolded before them. "Let me tell you a story," the father began, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "When I first tried to buy shares in this airport, many people didn't take me seriously. They saw what you saw today. They made assumptions based on how I looked, not who I was." The officer stood quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame as he listened. The teenager watched his father with quiet pride, understanding that this was about more than just one incident. But instead of getting angry, the father continued, "I chose to let my work speak for itself. Within 5 years, I had turned this airport into one of the most efficient and profitable in the country. And do you know what the secret was?" He paused, making sure everyone was listening. "The secret was treating every single person who walks through these terminals with respect. From the CEOs to the custodial staff, from first-class passengers to those buying the cheapest tickets. Everyone deserves dignity." A few feet away, the businesswoman who had recorded everything was sending her video to the customer relations department, as requested. Other passengers who had witnessed the scene were sharing their contact information with airport officials, ready to provide statements about what they'd seen. The father turned to address the head of security directly. "Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new training programs. Not just about security protocols, but about human dignity. Every staff member, from top to bottom, will participate." The officer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was different, humbled, but sincere. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I made assumptions that were completely wrong. I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I'm truly sorry." The teenager watched as his father considered these words. The crowd held their breath, waiting to see how he would respond to this admission of guilt. "An apology is a good start," the father said firmly, "but it's not enough. Actions have consequences." However, he paused, looking at his son, who nodded slightly. "Consequences can be constructive rather than purely punitive." He turned back to the officer. "You'll be working closely with our new diversity training team. Your experience today, your mistakes, and what you learned from them will become part of our training program. That is, if you're willing to be honest about what happened here and help others learn from it." The officer straightened up, understanding the opportunity he was being given. "Yes, sir. I would be grateful for that chance." The father then addressed the gathered airport officials. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer. This is a wake-up call. Our security protocols need to protect people's dignity as much as their safety." The head of security nodded firmly. "We'll start revising our training materials immediately, sir. And we'll make sure every staff member understands that security and respect go hand in hand." The teenager stepped forward. "Dad," he said quietly, "maybe I could help with the training too. Share my perspective." The father smiled proudly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The crowd watching this scene began to disperse, but many stayed to shake the father's hand or pat the teenager on the back. They had witnessed not just the resolution of an injustice, but a masterclass in turning a negative situation into an opportunity for positive change. 6 weeks had passed since the incident, and the airport's main training center was buzzing with activity. The large conference room was filled with security personnel, all there for the new mandatory training program that had grown from that memorable day. The officer who had caused the incident sat in the front row, but he wasn't there as a trainee. Instead, He had become an integral part of the training team, sharing his story with each new group. The change in him was remarkable. Gone was the arrogant authority figure, replaced by someone who had learned valuable lessons about humility and respect. I was wrong that day, he told the room full of his colleagues, his voice carrying the weight of genuine reflection. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I not only failed at my job, I failed as a human being. The room was silent, every person present understanding the courage it took to admit such mistakes. The teenager's father stood at the back of the room, watching as his son stepped up to the podium. In the weeks since the incident, the young man had become a powerful voice for change at the airport. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had turned a personal humiliation into a platform for positive transformation. Security and respect aren't opposing forces, the teenager explained to the attentive audience. They're two sides of the same coin. When we treat every passenger with dignity, we actually make this airport safer. His words resonated through the room, carrying the wisdom that came from his unique perspective. Airport staff members shared their own experiences, creating an open dialogue about assumptions and bias. A flight attendant spoke about times she'd witnessed discrimination. A baggage handler described moments when he'd been judged unfairly. Each story added another layer to the training, making it real and personal. The head of security, who had initially been skeptical about such comprehensive changes, now stood firmly behind the program. Our job is to ensure safety, he addressed the room, but we can't do that effectively if we're alienating the very people we're meant to protect. In one corner, the businesswoman who had recorded the original incident was back, this time officially documenting the training for the airport's records. Her video from that day had become a powerful teaching tool, shown at the beginning of each session as a reminder of how quickly situations could escalate when prejudice took over. The father watched as his son and the officer worked together, presenting different perspectives on the same situation. It was a powerful image, the two people who had started on opposite sides of a conflict now standing together to create positive change. This isn't just about following rules, the officer explained to his colleagues. It's about understanding that every person who walks through those terminal doors has a story. We can't judge those stories based on what we think we see. The training wasn't just talks and presentations. The team had developed practical scenarios, role-playing exercises, and real-world examples. Security staff learned to maintain safety protocols while treating everyone with equal respect. They practiced difficult situations, learning to check their assumptions before taking action. One of the board members who had witnessed the original incident stood up to address the group. What happened that day could have ended very differently, she said. Instead of positive change, we could have had lawsuits, bad publicity, and deeper divisions. The difference came down to how people chose to respond. The father finally stepped forward, joining his son at the front of the room. This airport serves millions of passengers every year, he said. Each one of them deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued. That's not just good business, it's basic human dignity. 1 year after the incident, the airport had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The training program that grew from that tense day had become a model for airports across the country. News crews gathered in the main terminal to cover the story of how one confrontation had sparked nationwide changes in airport security culture. The teenager, now a regular speaker at airport management conferences, stood confidently at the podium during the 1-year anniversary event. What happened to me that day was unfortunate, he said to the assembled crowd, but what grew from it has touched thousands of lives. Behind him sat his father, beaming with pride. Next to him was the officer, no longer just the officer who made a mistake, but now known as one of the most passionate advocates for respectful security practices. The change in him was so complete that new employees often had trouble believing he was the same person from the training videos. When I think back to that day, the officer shared with the audience, I'm actually grateful. Not for what I did, that was wrong, but grateful for the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. His words carried the weight of genuine transformation, touching everyone in the room. The head of security stepped up to share the results of their new approach. Passenger complaints had dropped by 60%. Security effectiveness had actually improved, proving that respect and safety could work hand in hand. Other airports had sent their teams to learn from their program, creating a ripple effect across the industry. A young traveler approached a teenager after the ceremony, tears in her eyes. "I saw what happened to you that day," she said. "I was there. And now, a year later, I'm a flight attendant. The way you and your father handled everything inspired me to join the aviation industry." The businesswoman who had recorded the original incident was there too, this time making a documentary about positive changes in airport security. Her original video, which could have been used to shame and punish, had instead become a powerful tool for teaching and transformation. The father stood to make the final speech of the day. "A year ago, we had a choice," he said, his voice carrying through the terminal. "We could have responded to prejudice with anger, to humiliation with punishment. Instead, we chose to build something positive. We chose to learn, to grow, and to change." Airport staff members, from custodians to executives, gathered to celebrate their part in the change. The VIP lounge, where everything had started, was now known for having the most welcoming and professional security team in the building. They had transformed a potential flashpoint into a model of excellence. The teenager and the officer now regularly traveled together to other airports, sharing their story and helping implement similar training programs. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of how confrontation could lead to collaboration, how mistakes could lead to mission. "The most important thing we learned," the teenager concluded, "is that change doesn't have to start at the top. It can start with one person willing to admit they were wrong, and another person willing to show grace. Everything else grows from there." As the ceremony ended, a new group of security trainees watched in awe. For them, this wasn't just a story. It was a blueprint for their own careers, a reminder that their job wasn't just about checking credentials and managing security lines. It was about protecting both the safety and dignity of every person who walked through those terminal doors. The father and son stood together at the window, watching planes take off into the sunset. What had started as a moment of prejudice had grown into a movement of progress. They had shown that sometimes the best response to ignorance isn't anger or revenge, it's education, understanding, and an unwavering commitment to positive change.